Hello, Magic Casters! My name is Chance, welcome to my Spellbook, and thank you so much for tuning into the 6th episode of our revised Cantrip series. Today we're going to be taking another look at Create Bonfire. We're going to do a real good deep dive on it, and I'm really excited to actually cover this cantrip. This, for the longest time, was actually my favorite cantrip in 5e, at least when I first started out. Just seemed kinda neat, and I still hold that opinion today, although I can honestly tell you I don't use it nearly as often as I used to. Create Bonfire was first introduced in the Elemental Evil Player's Companion, as with a ton of super cool spells, and it is usable by the vast majority of casters, including the Druid, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, and the Artificer. For whatever reason, the Bard doesn't get access to this spell, and I'm really upset with that. I suppose they can get it depending on which college they go with, but it's not found on their spell list, and that's really weird to me, because the idea of a bard around a bonfire makes a lot of sense. You know, they got like the old acoustic guitar or whatever instrument. I don't know, for whatever reason, no cigar for the bard. A little disappointing, but whatever. In any case, it's still a pretty good spell. Before we move on to its mechanics though, I just want to make a couple quick announcements. First and foremost, make sure you're watching this video in the playlist. You can access it by clicking on that little eye icon up in the top corner there, or waiting until the end of the video and clicking on the relevant end screen. I'm also going to be starting up another channel, and I'm super excited about it. I did a poll the other day to kind of gauge how you guys felt about it, and like 80% of you are really looking forward to it, so I might move it up in my timetable, so just keep an eye out for it. I'll talk about it more at the end of this video, but I'm super excited. In any case, let's move on to the mechanics for Create Bonfire. As with most damage-orientated cantrips, the damage this spell deals actually goes up as your character levels, dealing 1d8 damage at level 1, 2d8 damage when you hit level 5, 3d8 when you hit level 11, and capping off at 4d8 damage when you hit level 17. The effect at a glance: make a bonfire. It damages when creatures enter or end their turn inside the area. It's an instantaneous creation, so it's not like you have to sit there with sticks or anything, obviously. It is a spell, but that's the gist of what it does. The cast time is 1 action, the range is 60 feet, but the actual area of effect occupies a 5-foot cube. The duration is 1 minute, and it is concentration, so this is actually the first concentration cantrip we're going to be covering, or at least revisiting, I guess, because we've covered all the cantrips already. What this means is you have to maintain focus in order to maintain this effect. You can dismiss concentration at no cost, and doing so just causes the spell to fizzle out, so bear that in mind. And there are some other rules in relation to concentration spells. For example, you can't concentrate on more than one spell at once. There was rumors for a while that the Psionic class might let you do that, however, currently nothing like that exists in 5e. When you take damage, you need to make a Constitution saving throw to maintain your concentration. The DC for that throw equals 10, or half the damage you've taken, whichever number is higher, and that's why you want to invest a lot of points into Constitution as a caster. If you take damage from multiple sources, you make a separate saving throw for each source of the damage, so you can make multiple rolls in a single round. If you're incapacitated or killed, you lose concentration, which makes sense. Can't concentrate if you're not conscious, right? In any case, let's now move on to its saving throw. It is a Dexterity save, so when you cast a spell, the targeted creature makes a Dex save, and the DC is equal to your spell save DC, and they take 0 damage should they succeed on the Dexterity saving throw. The components are just verbal and somatic, meaning you have to speak forth an incantation and gesture with one hand. The school is Conjuration, which makes sense because you're conjuring a bonfire. Pretty neat. And the damage it deals is logically fire. Well, yeah, take that for what it is. It's a pretty common damage type for a lot of these damaging spells. Now let's move on to its full description. You create a bonfire on ground that you can see within range. Until the spell ends, the magic bonfire fills a 5-foot cube. Any creatures in the bonfire's space when you cast this spell must succeed on a dexterity saving throw or take 1d8 fire damage. A creature must also make a saving throw when it moves into the bonfire's space for the first time on a turn or ends its turn there. The bonfire ignites flammable objects in its area that aren't being worn or carried. This spell's damage increases by 1d8 when you reach 5th, 11th, and 17th level for a capstone of 4d8. Very good stuff. A couple things I want to go over here, and this is in relation to a sage advice statement that was made. The flames that this spell gives off are considered to be non-magical. You're literally just conjuring up a bonfire. I don't necessarily know if I like that or not, because you're creating the bonfire with magic, like literally conjuring it out of virtually nothingness. So I have weird feelings about it, and even in the spell's description, it says that it is a magic bonfire. So, whatever reason, Sage Advice ruled that the flames are considered to be non-magical. The question was asked in terms of manipulating it using control flames, which we've gone over in another video. So, I don't know, I guess that's neat, but it is a weird bit of wording in relation to the spell's description that makes me kind of conflict with that, but I thought it was just important to let you guys know. In terms of the spell itself, it's actually a really nice spell. 60 feet of range, super good, especially at those early couple levels when you're going to be a full caster, you're going to want to hang back a little bit. Not to mention just the ability to create a bonfire in general is kind of neat and makes for a lot of thematic flair. The cooler thing about this spell is it is technically a damage over time effect, at least it can be based on circumstances. Works really well when you can send enemies prone or prevent a consequence for them to move, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But overall, I like it. It's a pretty neat spell. Now let's move on to some alternative uses. The first way of using this spell outside of combat is to just use it as a campfire. At least use it to start one. It can ignite objects, so it might make things a little bit easier. The fact that it's magical flame seems to imply that it will work in situations where normal flame might not. Talk with your dungeon master about that, of course, but I think it makes sense. So even if it's raining or pouring or in a damp, soggy environment, I'd make the argument that this bonfire would still work, and this is particularly advantageous if you're dealing with a dungeon master who uses extreme weather. Not a lot of DMs do, for whatever reason, but I think it's just a fantastic layer to add to the game. So if you're in extreme cold, you can just continually recast this spell and kind of move it alongside you as you move forward. You can do this because it's a cantrip, so you can cast it limitlessly without really worrying about taking up any resources. To be fair, it does take an action, but I mean, you get that back presumably once every 6 seconds or so go nuts. Another way to use it is to really help orchestrate plans. This works really well when it comes to escapes. By this, what I mean is if you're escaping a narrow corridor or alley or what have you, just cast this behind you and keep running. It does damage over time and it does stay, and there's nothing here that says you need to maintain line of sight with it. As a result, it can serve as a pretty good deterrent if animals in particular are chasing you. Smarter humanoids or more magically versed creatures and monstrosities might not care, but most beasts are likely going to be afraid of fire, so this should work against them. There's some other uses as well that we'll get into a little bit more that involve combat, but the third alternative use that doesn't involve combat is using this to get rid of sensitive documents or blackmail material, or really just anything flammable. Because of the range of this spell, and because of the area it occupies consistently, it makes sense you'd be able to burn things into just straight up ash. Or something like Firebolt, for example, might only be able to sear it or hit some of them. Create Bonfire would just eviscerate all papers, which is pretty cool and might lead to some interesting chaos. Of course, you can use it to like burn down buildings and stuff, but any flame-based spell that specifies that it can ignite would be able to do that, but this is kind of more unique to Create Bonfire. Now let's move on to some potential combinations. The first is with a feat called Elemental Adept. We've talked about it in previous videos and we're likely going to continue because a lot of these cantrips are elemental based, so this really does pertain to them. So you essentially select an element from the following list, or a damage type rather, from the following list, of which fire is on, and then any spells you cast that are of that selected damage type, ignore resistances, and if you should ever roll a 1 on any of those damage dice, you treat it as a 2 instead. So it's pretty neat. The real key there is ignoring resistances. Fire is relatively commonly resisted at higher levels. Lower levels, you're likely not going to run into it too much, but still, nice to have that added security. Another potential combination is with the wizard spell, Potent Cantrip. Starting at 6th level, your damaging cantrips affect even creatures that avoid the brunt of the effect. When a creature succeeds on a saving throw against your cantrip, the creature takes half the cantrip's damage, but suffers no additional effect. This is perfect for Create Bonfire, as they do just make that check, and there's no added effect on top of that. Another great synergy with this spell is the Draconic Sorcerer's Elemental Affinity, assuming you go with one of the Fire Dragons. Starting at 6th level, when you cast a spell that deals the damage type associated with your Draconic ancestry, you can add your Charisma modifier to 1 damage roll of that spell. At the same time, you can spend 1 sorcery point to gain resistance to that damage up to 1 hour. This is pretty neat for a couple reasons. First and foremost, at 6th level, you should have a decently high charisma score, assuming you didn't pick it as a dump stat, and I don't know why you would, but assuming that, you're good. And 1 sorcery point at 6th level is just kind of meh. And in terms of meta magic, this works really well with Quickened Spell, but for a reason I'll talk about a little bit later. Quickened Spell lets you cast a spell that would normally take 1 action as a bonus action, so it frees up your action slot essentially. Now let's take a look at the heroes of the past, and you might be able to connect some dots here. The heroes of the past, if you're not super familiar, is a compilation of comments from the previous video I did on the relevant cantrip, in this case Create Bonfire. There's a lot of comments on each of those videos, and I didn't really pick the best by any measurable standard. I just picked the ones that I thought were the most interesting and that would fit on my screen in a fairly neat and tidy way. So feel free to check out the old video, link in the description, and I'm making a playlist for the old cantrips as well, and I'm kind of adding to it as I replace them with these revised versions. So do bear that in mind, but let's dive into the heroes of the past. Starting out with Gabriel Gagnon? I made a variant human paladin and got the magic initiate feat at level 1 and the warcaster feat at level 4. The 2 cantrips I got were Booming Blade and Create Bonfire. I get close, create a bonfire at their feet. When they try to move, I use my reaction to cast Booming Blade on them and they take thunder damage. Basically, at level 5, I've gotten it to where if they don't move, they take 2d8 fire damage, but if they do move, they take 2d8 thunder damage. I actually love this. I think this is so goddamn smart. You do run into the issue where those who are experienced fighters or are well versed with magic, they're likely just going to pivot around you. However, if you're dealing with beasts or low intelligence monstrosities, you're going to be able to cheese the heck out of them using this. I think this is absolutely genius, and this would work really well with the Quicken Spell meta magic, as that would free up his action to either attack or even cast another spell. And I know what you're saying, paladins don't get meta magic. Recently in the Tasha's Cauldron of Everything book, they added in meta magic adept, which lets you take 2 meta magics and gives you some sorcery points as well, so he could very well. The next comment we're going to be looking at is by Remor. Well, I could see this being a handy tool in locking down hallways and other tight spaces for short periods of time, but also for cutting off any pursuers simply by running across a wooden bridge and then burning it down. Alternatively, I wonder what would happen if this cantrip were to be used on a large amount of water, because it could perhaps cause steam to rise up, breaking the line of sight with anyone on the other side of the steam cloud, also fire arrows. I like this as well for a couple reasons. I find characters, and maybe this is the fault of DMs as well, but I find players almost never consider using environmental effects to their advantage. I think this is a great way to do it. In terms of the water bit, it really does depend on the Dungeon Master. Personally, it's a magic bonfire. The spell description says as much. Should be able to burn underwater. Don't see why not. However, if you're playing a very hyper-realistic setting, maybe the Dungeon Master would have a hard time with that. But in terms of cutting off pursuers, burning down wooden bridges, all top-tier plays, my friend. And then Oni No Sweeney says, I'm playing an Inquisitor Eldritch Knight with the unarmed fighting style. I grapple people and drag them into the fire, holding them there to cleanse them of their sins. A little bit dark, I guess, but, death to the heretics and all that. Overall, very clever, and a very good way of using a class feature or an alternative action to gain the most bang for your buck out of a cantrip cast, as well as, just kind of be a little bit of a badass. This would also work really well with the Quicken spell. And Mike Sheridan says, mold earth for a pit and bonfire at the bottom. Once again, very clever. Using this spell to create traps is really advantageous as it maintains for a full minute, and you don't need to maintain that line of sight on it. Very good stuff, very creative. The Azkaban then said, I use this spell with Thorn Whip to pull people into the bonfire over and over again. There are a handful of control-based cantrips. Lightning Lure's one, Thorn Whip's the other. Eldritch Blast can be one, depending on which Eldritch invocations they get, and Sapping Sting is arguably one as well. All of those cantrips have super huge synergy with Create Bonfire, simply because it maintains for a while. You can have it up and running, it deals relatively good damage, and you are also dealing damage on top using your control-based cantrip. Now let's move on to my personal thoughts. If you can't tell, I'm a relatively big fan of Create Bonfire. I understand if you're looking at raw damage potential, there are better cantrips to use, but if you're looking for cantrips with an edge to them, I say Create Bonfire has it. It's a nice way of providing damage simply for just kind of existing. It doesn't cost any actions to upkeep once it's up and running. I understand that it does take up your concentration, but that being said, it also costs you no resources, so there's nothing to stop you from stopping concentration, which would of course end the spell, and then focusing on another concentration spell. For that reason, I think it's still perfectly viable, even at top tier levels of play. There's also some really cool combinations you can use, especially with the Metamagic Quicken spell, but even outside of that, I still think it's plenty neat on its own, and the use of fire is sure to be useful when you're dealing with those beasts or similarly low intelligent creatures. Not to mention, just the fact that you can create a source of warmth and heat in pretty much any environment is certainly able to help you out during the survival aspect of most games. Now let's get to just a couple quick channel updates here. I am going to be starting up a new channel really shortly here. It's going to actually be a campaign for all of you to play in. I've been playing around with the idea for quite some time. When I was growing up, I really liked choose your own adventure books, and that's kind of what prompted me to get into DMing, really looking back at it. I just thought it was kind of neat, or at least led me to the trail of DnD. So I'd like to provide a similar experience to all of you, but do it in a video format. I think it's really cool. I've given a lot of thought into how to lay everything out and how everything would work. It will rely a lot on viewer feedback, which I'm not super worried about given the quality of the people who view this channel. I read through every comment, and I'm honestly always super impressed and super surprised with what you guys can come up with. So it's one of those things where I'd love to play in a game with all of you, but there's no feasible way all of us have the time to do that. So I'd like to make a channel that would kind of fulfill that role at least a little bit, and provide a Dungeons & Dragons experience worth talking about, even though I'm not really in the room with you. This would also be really helpful to people who work at odd hours of the day, or who don't necessarily have a friend group that plays D&D and just want to become familiar with the rules. Outside of that, it would be really handy to have for anyone trying to test out a build. We could give feedback fairly real-time-ish. it's a channel I'm going to have to be really involved with, especially with the commenters, so just be ready for that to be announced. I have the first couple videos scripted, and I have the first kind of arc, I guess, if you want to call it that, completed already, at least in terms of being storyboarded. I do need to script all of it, but I'm pretty confident with what I have. I hope you all enjoy it. I've ran it past a couple of the dungeon masters in my area, and a lot of them are really impressed, and they're looking forward to trying it out for themselves. I've ran a couple beta tests with friends, and they seem to really enjoy the style. So, assuming they're not all just lying to me to be nice, I'm really hoping you guys have the same experience. In any case, that's going to be it for now. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, or ideas regarding Create Bonfire, let me know down beneath in the comments section. And if you'd like to gain access to a free one-shot written by yours truly, just use code WELCOME over at the Guildhall, and check the pinned comment for links to my other channels. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you all have a great day, and as always, happy casting.